Welcome back to the Rose Garden Report podcast. I am Sean Highkin, the author of the Rose Garden Report newsletter, which you can subscribe to at rosegardenreport.com for the best independent coverage of the Portland Trailblazers you will get anywhere. The podcast you can get, as always, on Apple, Spotify, YouTube. We're on the Odyssey app, part of the Odyssey family. So go do all of that. Very, very, very excited about today's episode. We're gonna we're recording this on Thursday morning, so kind of a little over 24 hours before free agency starts. So I'm kind of staying away from that right now because anything I say about that is going to be dated and not have that much of a shelf life because a lot of stuff can happen pretty quickly. So we're going to kind of stay away from the free agency stuff and the Dame stuff for right now. But I'm very excited about this episode because I'm bringing back on a returned guest, Mirin Fader, my friend who's a feature writer for The Ringer and the author of the Giannis book that's a New York Times bestseller. I had her on a few months ago when she did a profile of Greg Oden, and I wanted to get her back on because the Blazers drafted, obviously, Scoot Henderson with the number 3 overall pick, and she wrote back in December one of the first major profiles of Scoot when he was still with the G League Ignite. And as with everything she writes, and I'll include the link to her story in the show notes and the YouTube links and the post on the website and all of that, but so you can all go read it if you haven't read it yet, but you should, because she has a lot of insight into kind of Scoot's upbringing and his background and his personality and the things about him that make it likely that he's going to be great in the NBA. And she, gets into a lot of that stuff in depth with me about, what she saw getting to know him and, what she thinks about kind of how he's going to translate to the NBA. And it's a really fun conversation. I think if you want to break from, how exhausting the Dame stuff is and the trade rumors and all of that, and you just want to get excited about Scoot, I think this is an episode that you're going to really enjoy. So let's get into that. How you doing, Mirin?
I'm good. I'm hanging in there. How are you doing?
I'm okay. I'm it's been a kind of a crazy couple of weeks on my beat, but, the way I've kind of started looking at it, like the Dame stuff's out of my control. Whatever happens with that happens. I'm trying to dive more into Scoot and get to know Scoot, which is why I wanted to bring you on, because you wrote a great profile of him back in December for The Ringer, which we're going to obviously link to in the show notes and stuff. But when did he first come onto your radar? Did you know about him before that big, game in Las Vegas against Wembanyama, or was that kind of when you first, realized like this might be a story that's worth doing, like the other top prospect besides Wemby?
Somebody on Twitter randomly tagged me and said you should profile this guy. Like, he seems really, really, just levels ahead of other people in terms of like mentality. And this person was like, he seems like somebody you would like to profile, somebody who has that sort of humble spirit, that human interest type of feature that you do. And then it became clear, I was like, so much attention is going to Wemby. And like, yes, I tried to get that profile as well. And I was like, you know what? Scoot's interesting. Like, just for his name alone, like, I want to pursue this story.
That's actually probably a smart move on your part, because you're gonna, even if you had gotten the Wemby, if they had said, yeah, you could get an interview with Wemby, everybody else that was at that Las Vegas game or whatever is trying to do a Wemby story. And so even if yours is going to be great, which yours is because everything that you write is great, but yours wouldn't have been the only one. Like, everybody, I remember, like, around the time of that game, everybody was doing a Wemby story, and yours was like one of the only ones about Scoot, where it was like, hey, this other kid like may not actually be the number 1 pick because Wemby's going to be the number 1 pick, but like this guy might be just as good or impactful or as much of a of a story. So you kind of actually were able to corner the market there. It was actually pretty smart.
Well, I appreciate that. I mean, it's interesting. It was like unintentional, the way that I've tended to profile younger players before they, have their moment in the NBA. But I just find it so interesting. I think the most interesting time to profile somebody is like either right at the beginning or right at the end.
Mm-hmm.
And, starting with LaMelo Ball, like that really taught me a lesson of just there's so many themes that, are interesting before somebody gets their name called at the draft. So I really do enjoy it.
Well, the LaMelo thing, that's actually kind of an interesting parallel to this Scoot story because they're both guys, and obviously, like, LaMelo has this whole, that was a whole other thing where, like, his dad took him and his brother to Lithuania, and, like, that, you know, was a whole thing, and he was, like, trying to start his clothing brand, or, you know, all that stuff. But
Yeah.
they both, you know, whether it was, you know, LaMelo going to Lithuania and then playing in Australia, where you also went to profile him for a second time, or Scoot, you know, working around the clock to graduate high school in 3 years so he could sign a 2-year deal with the G League Ignite. Both of them kind of took these unconventional routes and weren't just, you know, I'm going to go to college for a year and then, you know, go to the NBA. And they both kind of, you know, took these sort of different routes, which, you know, it's been very hit and miss whether that kind of stuff works or not. I mean, it's worked out pretty well for LaMelo because, you know, he's had a pretty good NBA career so far. And it seems like Scoot is completely set up for, you know, everything is there and everything is in place for him to also be really successful.
Yeah, I mean, I think the LaMelo thing was interesting because at the time people thought it was this crazy idea, but then you started to see more and more alternate routes. And, you know, I am of the person that believes, like, when something is different and something is unique, you should gravitate towards it instead of feeling, you know, uncomfortable and questioning whether it will work. Clearly, like, these things are here to stay. So it gave me such an education on, you know, hey, I think alternative paths are more of the norm. And I think that, honestly, to your first question, is really what made me interested in Scoot, because at that time, you know, people forget about that entire narrative. It
Right.
was so unique for him to leave high school and do this. Like, that, the alternative path was his quote storyline. You know, now the storyline is like, oh, second to, you know, Wemby and all this stuff, and will he work with Dame? But really, the original thing was like, does this guy really think that he can do this? You know, he got an offer from China at age 15. What's going on? Like, is he really that good? But I think, you know, people also forget that he made this choice prior to NIL legislation. So he was very much ahead of his time. You know, those options were not on the table when he was making that decision. It happened like literally right after, like, I would say like a month later or so.
So you think he might have, like, if the NIL stuff had been what it is now when he was in high school, you think he might have, like, decided to just go to college instead?
I don't know if I would take the leap and say he would have done that, but I think, and the reason why I say that is because he had sisters that did play in college, and they taught him how, you know, you really don't have a lot of autonomy when you're playing Division I ball. Your life is really, you know, just what they tell you to do, and you're more of a body than a human being. So I think even if they had NIL, he still had that sort of education in the back of his mind.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly I think it could have added to the conversation. I mean, that absolutely is a factor, and, you know, any prospect has to consider that.
Yeah, I mean, his sisters are very, very, very important to him and very,
Mhm.
you know, big influence on him. I remember this was maybe like a month ago or a little less at this point when the Blazers were going through their pre-draft workout process, and they brought him in for a solo workout, and they invited us out to the practice facility and we got to, you know, do little, you know, interviews with all the different prospects that they brought in. And so for Scoot's interview, he was talking about one of his sisters. And it was like, she's the goat. She's the Marietta goat. Of like he's quick to bring up his sisters and bring up his family as, like, this is who was influential on me. This is who, you know, pushed me. This is who helped me. And a lot of that is covered in the story that you wrote on the Ringer, just like how much, you know, his you know, growing up watching his sisters play basketball was, you know, something that made him want to pursue it, and how, you know, his dad would, like, light into him when he made a mistake on the court when he was in, like, 6th grade, but then also, like, went out of his way to make sure that he knew that, like, he loved him and supported him. So it's a
Yeah,
pretty interesting family dynamic there.
Yeah, and I think the family dynamic to me helps explain why he is so poised as a young person, why he's able to, you know, hold his ground, why he just, with older people, why he just seems older than he is and has that maturity. It's because his sisters were, like, so much older than him. The age gap is real. They were so much better than him. I mean, they would just, like, back him down in the post, and he was so, like, frail and, like, he didn't know what to do. And you know, I think, like, when you are just when you have a big family like that and there's always a sibling to play with, that you don't feel entitled, you don't feel special because there's just so many of you. And I think he really he learned humility from going against them. And his dad was really, really hard on him. And I think he had that kind of like pro coaching or
Hmm.
whatever from a young age. And so that's why he always played up. That's why physically he looks so NBA ready. And he did as a young person just because he started so much earlier than a lot of kids.
It's really incredible seeing him up close because he's only 6'2", so he's not that big for a point guard. But we stood right next to him when he came into Portland for his workout. He is built.
You know what I'm saying? That's what I mean.
Yeah, he's built like a linebacker, but
Yeah,
he's
he
a point
looks
guard.
developed. Yeah, exactly. Like I want to. That's what I was referring to. Is like
Yeah,
he looks like he has that regimen.
and it's interesting because as you detail also in the story, originally the sport that he wanted to play was football, and I saw another because I've been reading and watching all kinds of Scoot stuff since they drafted him to try to kind of get a feel for his personality and his game and stuff. And there was another interview that he did. I forget which one it was, but he did a podcast that he was on like a couple months ago where he was talking about how originally he thought he was going to go play football at the University of Oregon and then play for the 49ers. And then, as you kind of point out in the story too, like ninth grade or like high school was when he kind of decided like, okay, football is maybe not the sport I want to focus on. Basketball is the one that I really love and that I want to take seriously. Do you have any insight into when and how and why he decided that basketball was the thing to do? Because a funny thing in the story was I think it was like fifth grade or something when he was first starting to play basketball, and you said he hated it. Like when did he first grow to love it, and then how did that then go from, if you know this, like I mean, I'm sure I'll ask him this when I start actually talking to him and getting to know him, but I was wondering if you were able to, can I kind of glean when that transition was from like, oh, I hate this, I don't like this, to, oh, I actually love this and I want to devote my whole life to this.
Yes, and I would also add just that tennis was in the mix too, and
Yeah,
he's
you
like,
have that in the story.
better. Yeah, and so I was like, whoa, I love the fact that he hated basketball at first. And it's so funny because you contrast that with football. He would be in his like football uniform ready at like 6 a.m. and he would just be waiting on the stairs and doing his like, cheers. Like he was so amped up even
Uh-huh.
before he had his cereal. So to get a sense of just like where basketball was on the hierarchy early on. But I think it was those games against his sisters. I think he's so competitive that he didn't like losing to them. And I think that encouraged him to keep coming back. And the more he got better and he could hold his own and do better, I think he started to love it more. And I think his dad could see the potential that he had. And I think Scoot, instead of being discouraged by getting yelled at, I think it just made him fall in love with it further. So I think like maybe like mid to late middle school is when basketball became like the focus and the thing that he could see himself doing. And to be honest, I think it was also that offer from China, which was like the first pro opportunity that came at like 15. And I think that solidified in his mind, like, oh, there's a future for me in this sport. Like I could really take this somewhere.
So the China offer it wasn't one of those like, high school kids when they're like a freshman or a sophomore, if they're really good, will get an offer from a college that's, hey, when you graduate, that you could commit to this. It was, you're 15, we want you to come play in China right now.
Yeah, it was a Chinese team. Yeah, and he was like, "Oh yeah, of course, like I'm gonna go." Like in his mind.
And then without thinking about it, he was like, oh, this professional team wants me. I don't care where in the world it is. Let's go to. And then his parents were like, hey, wait a minute. Maybe you should actually think before you make this life-changing decision.
Well, exactly. And like I think that speaks so much to his competitiveness and how much he had like really fallen in love with basketball because to him he was like no brainer, duh, I want to go play basketball at the highest level. This is way, a higher level than, any of my peers right here in my class, in my neighborhood, in my school, in my state. And his parents were like, you're really young. You have to like actually live there. You won't be able to see us, your friends, all these things. So to me, I just think it just shows like his mindset was so much farther than other people. Like if you told me at 15 there would be a writer's residency somewhere, I
Uh-huh.
would my first reaction would not be like, great, let me go pack up my life in whatever country. But I just think that his willingness to do that, it shows the confidence, it shows the ambition, the drive. And he just naturally had that.
Well, but at the same time, you can probably relate to, whether it's, something related to like what you want to do for your career or just some idea that a friend of yours has, and like, hey, let's go do this. And then you take it to your parents and you're like, hey, my friend suggested we do this. Let's go do, like, I think this is what we're going to do. And your parents have to just be like, whoa, okay,
Like,
sit
what are you
down,
doing?
think about
Yeah.
this for a second. There's this great there's this great quote that you have in the story from Jason Hart, who is his coach at the G League Ignite, where he says, he has a phobia about his game, meaning he's in constant fear that he won't live up to his own expectations. He acts as though he's not going to make JV and not like a young star who just signed a multi-year deal with Puma. That's such a good that phobia line. That's such a good way of putting it that I've never really heard before.
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out because I really love that quote. And that's why when everyone's talking about, Scoot and his physicality, like what part of his game that they like, to me, the thing that stands out to him is the mental side of things.
Uh-huh.
And I think that people always think that people are driven to win or they're driven to be the best and be great and all these things, which is true for him too. But I think there's a part of him that's driven by like fear of failure. And a lot of people that are really, really, really great at what they do use fear as a motivator. And it's not to say you're not confident. It's not that at all. It's just that you're so raw and real with yourself. You want it so badly. You're so afraid of not being the player that you think you are in your head. And that's why I just think he's going to be so good, because when you have that mentality, you're not fully yourself. You're not drinking your own Kool-Aid.
Right.
And it's just a very mature mindset. And it's real. Like he said to me, he's like, I love watching myself mess up.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's like that's not just saying that. He's like, no, I search for those clips. I watch it. I study it. He's just constantly watching himself not perform to what he thinks he can be. And I think that that's really what makes him so special.
Have you seen the Mike Schmitz film session?
I did not watch that.
So Mike Schmitz, who now is in the Blazers front office, but was the like ESPN draft analyst for a long time.
Yeah.
He used to, back when he was still on ESPN, he used to do these things where he would sit down with a prospect and watch clips of them, and they would talk through their film sessions. He did one with the Twins also, who
Yeah,
you
no, I've
wrote
seen
about.
it. And I sat next to Mike in Lithuania, which is the
Yeah.
most hilarious thing. He was
Yeah,
at the-
Mike's awesome. Mike's great.
Yeah,
But
he's
like,
really cool. Yeah.
but he like I watched, like, after they drafted Scoot, I went and watched the one that he did with Scoot. It's just like 20 minutes of them going over his clips, and he showed one of like Scoot blowing a defensive rotation or something, and Scoot immediately was able to be like, yes, I should have been here. I messed this up. This is exactly like the stuff that my coach has been having me work on to get better at this specific thing that you showed me messing. Like, it seems like, for a 19-year-old, like, I'm always blown away by, like, the longer I do this and the older that I get, because, like, I get older. These kids coming into the league stay the same age.
Yeah.
And so you kind of can, gauge, like, okay, this kid is, like, really self-aware. This guy, knows what he has to do to be great. With Scoot, I haven't even really started getting to know him on a personal level yet, but you're already just blown away by the amount of self-awareness that he has and the amount of, like, knowledge of, like, how much work it's going to take for him to get, be as great as he wants to be.
Well, and not just those qualities, but about defense. There's so many people his age that don't even think about defense. Like, it's not, it's the age old thing. Oh, he'll figure it out. Like, he'll learn. But Scoot's already thinking about defense. I mean, I was there for like the film session with the team where Coach Hart was like basically saying like, you should have been there. And so, Scoot, for whatever people want to say about the G League, whether they think it's a good path or not, like Scoot was very complimentary of how he learned a lot while being there. And I think particular attention was paid to his defense.
Mm-hmm.
So I just think it's not just that he's, picking apart his weaknesses. I think it's that he's studying both ends of the floor, which also like really separates young people.
Yeah, I mean he's talked before, and some other interview of, it wasn't in yours, but it was some other interview of his that I read where he talked about like he's studying Drew Holiday for how to be a good defensive guard.
Yeah,
It's like, okay, 19-year-old kid talking about studying Drew Holiday's defense, like
right,
that's a good sign that even if he physically is never able to get that good at defense, the fact that he's that age and he's already talking about like this is what I want to study, this is what I want to focus on, like
right,
the
right.
mental stuff is such a big part of it. Let me ask you this: this was not the first time you had done anything with a G League Ignite prospect, because you did a story on Jalen Green a couple of years ago,
Yeah.
who also came out of the G League Ignite and was a #2 pick to Houston. What are some of the differences? Because I'm assuming, and I mean maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, because that Jalen Green story I think came out while COVID was still kind of going on, so maybe you didn't have as much in-person access back then as you would have now. So you can correct me if I'm wrong about that. But like, what are some of the differences in the program and like how their whole operation is that you saw from back a couple years ago when you did the Jalen Green story to when you were around the team now to do the Scoot story?
Well, it didn't. I think the Jalen story was actually even before he went to the G League, because I remember going to Fresno to
Mm-hmm.
spend time with him at his high school. So it was before, he joined the Ignite. So just a little caveat there. But it's grown tremendous. I did profile another Ignite guy, Principal Singh, the player from India,
Oh yeah.
who played on Ignite, who actually the same year as Jalen. Um, and I think it's come a long way. But as you can see in my Scoop profile, the opening scene is them being locked outside of a high school gym.
Yeah.
It's not this like glamorous path where the red carpet's laid out for you. I mean, Las Vegas is so spread out. It's very hard to get access to gyms. Um, the G League really struggles with that, especially in Vegas. I mean, Scoot had to warm up by just dribbling in the parking lot. So
Mm-hmm.
it's, I think Ignite has come a very long way from like, the Jalen year, the principal year, but it's still obviously got a long way to go in terms of, amenities and stuff. But the arena is really cool. I mean, it's an NBA experience. Um, I think that Scoot and people like Jalen have brought a lot of attention to the G League as far as like, hey, if you are a top prospect, this can work for you. But it's kind of the way that I feel about, say, the Thompson twins at Overtime Elite, that I
Yeah.
profiled them as well.
Mm-hmm.
The program can work or not work, but it's really about you and how good you are and how willing to work you are. And I think that those players just had those intangibles. So whatever deficiencies there are with these upstart leagues, it kind of like doesn't really matter because the talent and the work ethic is so there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think all of them are so new. All of them are still trying to figure out how to run themselves essentially. I mean, it's like all the startup culture we see in tech, we're like seeing it in basketball now.
Yeah, and the G League one is a little bit. I mean, the Overtime Elite one is a little like I know a little bit less about that one, but I read your story about the Twins, and that was the Blazers brought both of them in for workouts, and so I was doing some research on them before the draft. I'm very impressed by both of them also. So, but I know a little bit less about the overtime thing. Whereas at least with the G League Ignite, at least like the G League is like an an established thing. It's funded by the NBA. It has the NBA infrastructure. There are NBA players, like a player that is one of Scoot's close mentors is Pooh Jeter, who has been a longtime G League player, international player. The Blazers actually just hired him as the assistant GM of their G League team that they just launched earlier this week. But you're playing against grown men, and you're playing against people who actually have NBA experience, and you have NBA caliber trainers, and you have NBA caliber, like you said, their arena is an NBA experience. So like you get a little bit more real experience and an idea of what the NBA level is going to look like there than maybe you would in college or in something like Overtime Elite that doesn't have that type of infrastructure.
I mean, it's really intense. Like essentially all 10 people on the floor are all fighting for their lives. And all 10 people like need to score 20 points a game. I mean, not
Right.
literally, but like that's it's very, very competitive. And, you look on Twitter and people are just really like stupid and like just comment, oh, this is up.
That could be true about literally any topic, what you just said.
I know. But you know how people are like, that guy's a bum, that guy sucks. They have no idea that the
Right.
person they think is the worst person on an NBA roster or the worst person on a 10-day with the G League or whatever, that player has beat out thousands and thousands and thousands of people. And so this idea that Scoot was just going against subpar players, it's really just not true. Like those guys actually have more incentive to play hard than the average NBA player, because their lives are not guaranteed. I mean, the intensity level is real, and they're older and they're better and they're smarter and they have something to lose. So I just think that is really, really a competitive level.
Well, we just saw the Heat make the finals, and like the big graphic that ESPN put on every single one of their games was
Yeah.
they have 7 undrafted players. Like, yeah, all those undrafted dudes like Max Strus and Gabe Vincent and whoever, like those guys all played in the G League. Those guys all came up this way, and those guys are all, contributors on a team that made the finals. Like the talent level just across the board is so much higher now than it was 10 years ago.
Derek White, like
There
another
you
guy
go. Yeah.
profile.
Yeah.
Like it's just really, it's intense. Even somebody like Austin Reeves, like you talk about, like,
Yeah.
going undrafted or whatever. Like there's so much talent, and that's why I just think like the mental side is really what separates people, right? Like it's that, okay, we're going to practice again at this little dinky gym in the middle of nowhere, fighting for my dream. How can I make it? Like the guys that stick, the people like Pooh, like you mentioned, like they have that.
Totally. How do you think? I mean, it's so interesting because one of the things in the story that you kind of hit on a lot was his leadership and that aspect of kind of his personality and what he brings as a player. And I'm so fascinated by a kid. I mean, especially like now he's 19 and now he's had a couple years in the G League, but he first comes in having graduated from high school in 3 years. He's this 17-year-old kid who comes in, and like I said, like we talked about, he's got grown men on his team who have been pros for 10 years or more. And this kid who's making more money than any of them because he just signed this big 2-year $1 million deal, and he has this Puma deal. So this kid that comes in is making more money than any of these guys. And he's trying to say like, "Oh, I'm the leader. I'm trying to, that's something I want to assert." I know like Scoot's personality is like not super domineering and is, very humble, and so that probably made it easier for people to accept. But I'm so interested in that dynamic of like a kid coming in that young trying to do that, and how people much, much, much older than him in some cases react to that.
Well, it's not stepping on toes. It's not getting in there and being like, "Hey, I'm the next whatever." He's just not like that at all. But it's little things, like he is a kid. He likes Rice Krispies and stuff. He has his house, and they get all these snacks and he shares it, and his house is known as like the snack house, and like his teammates enjoy being around. It's like little things like that. The other thing is like, he's had his welcome to the, pro ranks moments, like missing your flight at
Yeah.
5 a.m.
I like that anecdote in the story.
It was one of my favorite anecdotes in the piece. He's like so nervous about not waking up, and he stays up all night, and he's sitting in his chair, and he's like, "I'm not going to go to sleep. I'm not going to go to sleep. I'm not going to miss my flight." And then he misses his flight. So I think, honestly, part of being a leader is showing your weakness and saying, "Hey, I fucked up too." And I think they just saw that, like, okay, he is young, but he is so talented and so earnest. He felt so bad about missing the flight that like they have no choice but to respect the humility that he brings.
Right.
And tries to do better. And, he never missed a flight ever again. Never did anything.
Right. And even a situation like that, you think he's not coming in like, "Oh, I'm this kid that just signed this $1 million deal. I don't need to show up on time for the flight." He actually was trying to stay up for the flight, and he fell and he crashed.
Exactly.
Like,
And I think it's also like a leader is somebody who's like really comfortable in their own skin, and like the way Scoot moves around. Like he's so funny. Like he'll just start dancing out of nowhere. And, I think they just like his authenticity, and then they see what a bookworm he is. Like that, as you know, like I love books. That was one of my favorite parts about the piece, is that his nose is always in a book. So I think his teammates saw like, hey, this guy's funny. Yes, he's really a kid. Like I said, Rice Krispies, all that. But he's a very serious person. He's in his room like with a book. So I just think people respect that he is so introverted too.
What kind of books does he read? Because you talk a lot about this one book, The Purple Cow, which is like a business, type, self-help book that was a big influence on him. Do you know what I'm assuming this is something you bonded with him over because you're obviously a huge book person also, but like what type of books does he read?
Yeah, it is a lot of similar books like self-help, like ones that are more well-known, like Seven Agreements, stuff like that.
Sure.
But he's very business minded. Like like a lot of young players coming up, like they definitely are thinking about business and money and the economy beyond this moment. So he reads a lot of like business stuff in addition to like self-help stuff. And he sort of approaches reading like not necessarily like the way that I do for like, pleasure or like
Sure.
escapism. He's like mining the pages for information. He's like he wants to learn as much about how he can like get better or do this or have this asset or do that. So I think he's more of like a reader for information. It's like another edge. But the other thing is like, and this is what I mean by the G League is a really good experience. He was reading because he was alone so much, and that's a part of the pro experience that people don't realize, which is like you can't be on the court like a million hours a day. Most of your time outside of the team is like literally by yourself. And so he was bored, like he had to do something.
Yeah.
And so he started like really getting into reading.
You know who I'm going to make a prediction right now. You know who his best friend on the Blazers is going to be?
Who?
Matisse Thybulle.
Oh,
Do you know Matisse Thybulle at all? Have you ever?
Well, I was supposed to profile him, and it just like never happened. But yeah, I could see that.
Matisse is one of the biggest readers that I've ever encountered in the NBA. He got traded here from Philadelphia halfway into the season at the trade deadline, and every single time I'm in the locker room, he has a different book in his locker, and he was like giving players books, and it's all different genres. Like some of it is like the business self-help type of stuff, but like he reads novels, he reads poetry, he reads like biographies. I remember one team staffer, not even a player, like a team staffer, I forget who it was, but it was a team staffer, was telling me that, he was asking them like what their major was in college, and it was like history, and so he got that person like a book about World War II or something. Like if Scoot is this big reader, I can just see him and Matisse just like taking to each other like
I love
like that. Yeah. How do you we have to talk about the Dame stuff. It's in your story that back in 2021 he reached out to Dame just asking for advice.
Yeah.
And Dame got back to him. I know that Dame was at his workout in Portland last summer, or not last summer, like last month. Sorry, I can't talk right now, but like last month.
There's a lot going on. There's a lot.
Yeah. And that they have been in touch during the whole pre-draft process. Obviously, there's kind of a lot going on with Dame right now, and will continue to be so for at least the next couple weeks in one direction or the other. Do you think that they can actually play together on the court?
I have no idea, but let's take it back. I think it was really funny because when I was there, he received the day of the interview. He had received the DM the night before
from Dame.
So it was like very fresh, and this was like a very exciting moment for Scoot. And like he showed me the DM, and to give you an example of the type of like respect that he has for Dame and the humility, I think I forgot the exact wording, it's in the story, but he used both names, like, yo, Damian Lillard, my name is Scoot Henderson. Like instead of just being like, yeah, my name is Scoot, like I'm, as if you should know who I am. He was like, Scoot Henderson, here's my name. And he was like, can you, and and what I respect is that he wasn't just like, "Hey, what's up?" Like, whatever. He asked a specific question about letting go of misses and, when your shot isn't falling and it's being imperfect, right?
Hmm.
Because food is preoccupied, like we said, with fear of failure and all of these things. So I just thought that was so interesting that he came with a specific thing. It's kind of like, when I remember being coming up and I would reach out to different writers, and you can't just be like, "Hey, I love your work." You have to like ask a specific,
What's some
like,
advice? And it's like there's so, I mean,
"Can I pick your
I
brain?"
get those emails too, and I'm sure you do. And like there's so
Oh
many different, like if somebody says, "Hey, do you have some advice for getting into the business?" Like, okay, what am I supposed to do with that? There's so many different directions. But if you have like, "Hey, what is this specific thing that like,"
yes.
not only does that like show, and I mean this is just, advice for anybody reaching out to anybody in the field, whatever field they want to get into. If you ask them a specific thing
Yeah.
that they are good at that you want to know more about, that's going to make that person feel like he isn't just like that. That probably made Dame feel like this kid isn't just sending this DM to like every different NBA player that he follows. He actually specifically sent this to me for a specific reason and actually wants this answer from me specifically. And that's going to make somebody more likely to respond and, respect you.
Literally, exactly. And it's not just, "Hey, can I pick your brain?" which like
Yeah.
kills me every time.
I hate that phrase.
No, I hate stop, nobody pick my brain anymore. I don't have anything. But I think it's exactly what you just said, and that's why I think Scoot is so intelligent and he's so introspective and he's a studier. And I think that the exact question that he asked Dame was so interesting because yes, I see that when I see Dame. Like you see this confidence, but you know that Dame is also human, and so for every Dame time moment, there were also moments, I'm sure, where he wasn't as confident or wasn't in his flow. So I just love that Scoot like made that relationship. And when Scoot was showing me the DM, he was just so geeked. It was just, and this is what I mean by like, I love profiling young guys at this stage because they're so excited and they're so green. There's no sense of being jaded. He was like, "Look, he messaged me last night."
He responded to my message.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, and it's like again, it's like imagine yourself like reaching out to your favorite writer.
right.
It was like me when like Wright Thompson emailed me back like after my Live
And
Away.
you're just like, oh my god, Wright Thompson knows I exist.
Literally,
Wright Thompson read my email. Like, it doesn't even matter what he says or if he can like
I didn't
help
even
get
get
you a
ready.
job or whatever. It's like he knows I exist. He knows who I am.
Exactly. And so I look at, Scoot being as highly touted as he is, and to have that very like refreshing humility, I found so endearing.
Uh huh. And I mean, Scoot, I think, is a little bit just in what little I've gotten to be around him since the draft happened and all that. He's a little bit more of like a brash, like loud personality than Dame is, but their mental approach and just kind of their attitude towards life and towards work and towards all this stuff, it strikes me as very similar.
It's really interesting because like I think back to I forgot when this was, but do you remember when like Dame was talking about how like this is not pressure, this
Mm-hmm.
is just basketball, like pressure, and he was talking about real life pressures. I forgot.
Was this on the was maybe he was on the JJ Redick one?
This was like a couple years ago. It was like it was kind of, it wasn't as like viral as like the Giannis quote on
Right.
failure, but it
No, but I
was.
mean, Dame says stuff like that all the time, so I'm sure I'm sure I've heard exactly the one that you're talking about. But
Yeah.
yeah, I know what
Yeah.
you're talking about.
It was years ago, and it was so profound, and he was saying that like, this is just ball. Like this is not pressure. And I think Scoot is exactly the same way in that he views this game as like entertainment, and
Uh huh.
it's not pressure because it's just fun. And so it's like, yes, official NBA game, very serious, but it's also like this is the game that my sisters were backing me up in the post X years ago. Like this. And I think he approaches it like that. Like the one thing that I really liked, and I think Dame obviously has this as well, is that, Scoot was saying how he was really moved by when Kobe said, sometimes I'll have a game and I know that there's a kid or somebody who came to this game all the way to see me, or they paid this amount, and I can't let them down. I have to show out. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and he's very conscious of that. And I think Scoot and Dame both have that sense of like realizing it's bigger than basketball. People really came to see me play. Like I have an obligation here. I have to show out. And then there's that like underdog mentality that Dame and Scoot have. Dame's journey, and
Right.
he wasn't supposed to be this big superstar. Well, ironically, people don't even talk about that with Scoot. He was very under recruited, quote unquote. And I know you're saying, how can you be under recruited when, you had an offer at 15 from China, but
Well,
really
but
like at first,
you go
yeah,
into in the story, you go into the colleges that he had offers from, and it was like Auburn, which is like not
yeah.
a small school, but it's not like he was getting offers from like Duke and Kentucky and UCLA and all these just like big time programs.
Exactly. Like he wasn't like, oh my God, Scoot Henderson is the next big thing. And, in our culture that like really valorizes the youngest as possible, if you don't have like the big programs recruiting you by 8th grade, people are almost looking at you like, what's wrong with you? And I think that, Scoot had the benefit of having such a present family that reminded him that rankings aren't important and that, development and getting better is important. So it's just, I think of that journey of that feeling like, passed over or whatever, that really him and Dame like both have that in their histories. So look, like I have no idea what's going to happen. But I think they're really two really thoughtful, interesting people that understand that while this game is so important, there's so many things obviously outside that are important. I think they're both like
Yeah.
really stand up guys.
I really hope Dame sticks around for a lot of reasons, but I also think he will be so good for Scoot.
Yeah. I mean, look, if that DM, imagine having that every day.
Yeah.
Imagine asking him questions like that every day. How much better Scoot could get, because Dame is just, he's a genius. Like, how
and
cool
Dame really the thing I obviously I know Dame quite well because I covered him for years. He really respects when somebody cares and puts in the work and wants to get better and wants to ask questions. This past year, there was there's obviously that quote from his exit interviews where he was like, I like Shaedon Sharpe, but like that's enough 19-year-old. But like Shaedon Sharpe, like I think when the Blazers drafted Shaedon Sharpe last year, instead of trading that pick, Dame was like, I don't know about this. But then he got to know Shaedon and was like, okay, this kid asks good questions, this kid listens, this kid wants to get better, this kid, puts in the work, and he really came around to, I like this. And I kind of think, just based on the mentality that Scoot has and everything that you've told me about him and everything that I've read about him in your story and others and other interviews that I've watched, they are just so similar in personality that I think Scoot can learn a lot from Dame, and I think Dame has a lot to offer Scoot if it ends up going that way, whatever happens with free agency or trades or whatever else.
Yeah, I agree. And it also reminded me of like our conversation about books and business. Like Dame is very like business oriented.
Oh, yeah.
And the fact that he has all this stuff going on outside of basketball with music and all these, the shoes, like I just think I could imagine that Scoot's questions would cross over to like, okay, how do I be a successful businessman outside of this?
The other thing also, and this is something that Scoot mentioned because after the draft, he was in New York. Blazers media, for the most part, was not. But so we did like a Zoom call with him from the draft that night. As far as like wanting to be a great point guard and wanting to learn, how to do that, who is the head coach of the Portland Trail Blazers right now? Chauncey Billups.
Yeah, that's true.
And he said on the night of the draft, he's like, I'm gonna pick Chauncey's brain. So I hate that phrase. I just realized when I was saying what the quote was that he said the other night. But we were just talking about it. But he was like, I'm gonna pick Chauncey's brain so much that he's gonna get annoyed by me. He said that on draft night.
Wait, is Scott Brooks still an assistant coach?
He is, yeah.
Okay, so I interviewed Scott for my book on Hakeem Olajuwon because Scott's
the best.
He's so awesome, and he was a teammate on the championship team with the Rockets in '94. Anyways, I bring up Scott because obviously, yes, Chauncey, like point guard, you could ask him a trillion questions. I mean, Chauncey like destroyed my childhood with the Pistons Lakers.
That's right.
So like I've seen it like very up close.
Yeah.
But I bring up Scott because Scott has such a wealth of information. He knows how to be a good teammate. He's so smart. And he learned a lot from Hakeem about what it takes to be a pro and how to give back and just, I don't know, just being a consummate professional all the
Hmm.
time and play your role. And obviously Scott was in a very different position than Scoot is in his career, like as a role player versus Scoot as
Sure.
a star. But I just think, I hope they get close
Hmm.
because, you know, Scott has a wealth of information to share. So it's not just Chauncey in my eyes.
No, totally. And Scott Brooks, besides, playing with Hakeem and being on those championship teams with Houston, as a coach, he coached Russell Westbrook.
Right. I
He
mean,
coached John Wall in Washington. Like,
exact
say
that's
he's
what
coached the same type of like explosive athletic point guard that Scoot Henderson is. He's coached those guys before.
exactly, like, yeah, that's exactly, great point. Yeah, I just think there's a lot of people that Scoot can learn from. And he's a learner, he's a studier, he's
Hmm.
literally a listener. And I loved hearing about like Scoot's dad putting him in film sessions. Can you imagine like a child in film sessions? I
How old
feel
are we talking here?
like a baby, like he was at his sister's games and then they'd all be watching film, and so like
Uh
he
huh.
was at their film sessions from really really young, like pre-middle school. So I just think he has that attention span, that like focusing is a skill, listening is a skill, dissecting is a skill. And I can just see him watching film with these people and like being so intent.
Yeah. How's the Hakeem book going? The last time I had you on here was when you wrote you had written the Greg Oden story, and we had to talk around it because you had told me privately what the next book was, but you had not announced it publicly yet, so we
Yeah,
couldn't actually
that's
talk
right.
about it. Now it's out there, so now I can actually ask you how's it going? How's the book coming?
I'm in the writing part. It's a book is such a grind. I think it's
Right.
just hard having like a normal job and a book at the same time, which obviously is such a privilege and a blessing. So I'm really trying to balance as best I can, because I want to have all these features out at the same time. I want to pursue the best stories, and at the same time I know that like, okay, this book is requiring so much of my mental space, my time, my effort. But it's been fascinating. I think, when you and I were at Bleacher,
Yeah.
there was like this rule that was spoken and unspoken that like you couldn't really profile an older person. Like there were no coach profiles. Like we weren't allowed to do coach profiles. Like I don't know if you remember that, but it was
I don't think you and I had the same set of editors and the same set of rules.
that's true.
That's a whole other conversation we can probably have off air,
But
but
I wasn't we weren't allowed to profile coaches. Like that was just a no-no because they were
uh
like, BR is a younger audience, and so we don't want to hear about older people. So I would say for a lot of my career, and maybe this goes back to how our conversation originally started, I really didn't profile anyone, above 35. So it's been such a fascinating experience to, in a sense, profile over, 130,000 plus words, somebody who's so much older that has lived a life. And it's really made me want to do more of this work in my ringer stuff, like coach, like Scott Brooks, like he would make a fantastic profile, and part of it is that, teams don't make coaches available. So that's kind of like
no.
impossible. But anyway, this project has really made me just have such a different experience than my normal thing. And, I was born in 91. So Hakeem got his first title when I was like 3. So
Yeah.
it's been really fun for me to like study a different era. Like I said, Chauncey, Lakers, Pistons, Lakers, like that was my, childhood. Like I went to
Right.
Staples Center to go see one of those road games, quote, live. So I was not around for this era of Hakeem Olajuwon, and it's been such an education for me, but also just such a pleasure to watch 90s highlights. I mean, it's so different than today. I love it.
That's like the perfect zone of like all that stuff was on TV, all that stuff exists, all that stuff is on YouTube, but it's
Right.
not so recent that like you remember watching it at the time, so you're still like learning and discovering new stuff. It has to be a little bit different though, because the Giannis book, you wrote that book like while Giannis was like at his apex of like right around like that book came out right around when he won the first title
Exactly.
with the Bucks. So like he's in his prime right now. He's still very much like the guy right now, whereas Hakeem was that guy almost 30 years ago at this point,
Exactly.
and so now it's like a whole, there's way more other people that like he's either played with, so it's like older people, younger people, because also like there was that whole thing I remember like 10 years ago, every time there was like a center who was like being talked about, it was like, oh, Dwight Howard spent the summer working out on post moves with Hakeem Olajuwon, or like Brooke Lopez worked out with him. Like that was a thing for like 5 years in the NBA, that like that was what every big man would do during the summer, was go work with Hakeem.
Exactly. And that's why I just feel like he's the forgotten pioneer. He's just the most underrated superstar, of his generation. And he's worthy and deserving of, a treatment like this. And it has been really interesting to see. I thought it would be easier than the Giannis book because much time has passed. He's, older, but there's also other challenges of memory, right? Like memory is a tricky thing in the moment and beyond. How somebody remembers something 40 years ago
Right.
is not necessarily the same as what happened 40 years ago. And I think with somebody like him, his nickname Hakeem the Dream, there is a real mythological storytelling aspect to this, much like Giannis, the fairy tale of Giannis. And so I just think I find that really interesting. So I'm more, embracing that challenge of, just first of all, who's alive? Like Bill Fitch, his first.
I was going to say, yeah.
Not here anymore. But it's been cool because I'm somebody who likes I'm a studier. I'm a researcher. Before this, like in college, I helped my professor with her book on Toni Morrison. Like I had the training of somebody that wants to get like a graduate degree. I was doing that sort of close reading research. And all those skills are the same ones required for a project like this that is way more archival. Like I'm reading through Houston Chronicle 1981, 1982. You got to love that, research and be disciplined enough to like really sift through the history of this.
Do we have a date yet for the book?
So it's due this October and it's coming out 2024. Don't have exact date when in 2024, but it is definitely slated for 2024.
Okay, well I'm looking forward to that one because like I'm kind of like you. I'm well aware of Hakeem Olajuwon's legacy and all of that, but I don't know as much of like the detail, like because like I've been around and doing this for Giannis's whole career, so
right.
I'm very familiar with like all the characters in the Giannis book and like the landscape of the NBA while he was rising, because it's like basically current, whereas you and I are around the same age. I think I'm a couple years older than you are, but like you and I are around the same age, so we kind of grew up watching the NBA in kind of the same time. So it's not like there's gonna be a lot more stuff I don't know in this book than there was in the Giannis book. So I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, no, I hope you like it, and I hope that theme of the world, what it really seeks to do is not just be a standard biography, but show that this current landscape that we're talking about, the Giannis, the international world that I talked about so much in the first book, it goes back to Hakeem. He's the pioneer that doesn't really get that credit. There were no international stars before him. He helped, be that catalyst. It's fascinating to think about. So I need all the writing gods, all the reporting gods to pray for me to get this draft in. But I look forward to.
You've already done it once. You've already done it once. You're gonna do it again.
That's right.
And it's gonna be, the Giannis book was a New York Times bestseller. This one's also gonna be a New York Times bestseller. You should do Arvydas Sabonis next, by the way.
Oh my God. Well, it's funny. I was thinking, people are like, what's your third one going to be on? I'm like, my third one?
No, I know. I'm sure you get a million people suggest, but as you're talking about like, the origins of like international stuff, but then also like something that has a connection between like the NBA of that back then versus now, because his kid is in the league now, like that would be a really fascinating one for somebody to do. If not you, then somebody.
No, it really would. Or even just like a normal profile. That's a really interesting idea for sure.
Yeah. Well, I'll see. You said you're not going to be at Summer League.
I'm not going to be at Summer.
Okay, so I won't see you there, but I I got to get down to LA at some point soon.
You got to get back down to LA. Remember, what did we have in Vegas? It was this like giant milkshake. I'm remembering.
Holstein's.
Oh my God. It was like bigger than me, right?
Yeah.
It was just like.
I mean, that was so wild because like, so we got dinner that one night, and then the next night, because you were in town. I had just gotten in town for summer league. This was 2019, so this was like right before. This was like the summer before COVID.
Oh yeah.
So you were in town doing the Aces, and it was like the one time that like our schedules lined up. So we got dinner, and then the next day you were over at the whatever the arena is that the Aces play in for a. For an Aces game because you were working on that story. That same night, I was over at Summer League for the Zion debut, and there was an earthquake.
Oh my God, yes. I was.
And you were texting me like freaking out because like you're from LA, so you deal with earthquakes all the time, but like, you were still just like freaking out, and I was just like,
I totally forgot about. I was like, I don't do this. I don't like.
There's been a whole pandemic since then. It's easy to forget about it.
Oh my God, the arena was shaking. And the crazy thing was like, I was traveling with the Aces. I was doing like an embed thing, and we had to fly to New York at like 3 a.m. to go play the Liberty. And I was like, okay, so basically I'm not going to sleep because I'm afraid if I go to sleep, there will be another earthquake and we will all die. And I remember like Asirit was there and she was like, do you want to go hang out? And I was like, I'm not chancing it because of the thing. So I just stayed in my room.
Yeah.
On some scoot, like we gotta wake up, don't go to sleep.
Yeah. Either I need to get down to LA, or when the Hakeem book comes out, you need to actually do a book tour and come here and do a signing at Powell's, because the Giannis book came out like when COVID was still just like at the height of it, so you didn't actually get to do a real like book tour or do appearances or any of that.
Robbed of that experience.
Yeah.
But I look forward to a Powell's meetup.
Gotta happen. Well, I'll talk to you soon. Thanks a lot for doing this.
Thank you so much.